Drains, they are in fact artificial rivers, and the system in the limestone coast is quite unique in Australia. It's a story 140 years in the making, full of struggles and successes, finally giving us more than 1,500 kilometres of watercourses, and more are planned. But first, let's look at the geology, the formation of the land, and therefore the reason that drainage is necessary. Just after Australia separated from Antarctica 50 million years ago, the whole area shown on the map was part of the ocean floor. Lace corals and shells of sea creatures formed a thick sea bottom of limestone. This is now above sea level and is called the limestone coast. The limestone coast gives us a good record of the rise and fall of the sea level over the past million years. About that long ago, the shoreline was the line of hills stretching from Penola to Narracourt and Pathaway. The land has gone on rising slowly, and there have been erratic rises and falls of sea level caused by the freezing or melting of the Antarctic ice cap. The changing shoreline created a series of parallel coastal dune systems, or dune ranges. Next, the sand dunes formed at Baker's Range 500,000 years ago. The hills called East and West Avenue Ranges represented the coastline about 400,000 years ago, while Reedy Creek Range and the Dairy Range were formed about 200,000 years ago, about the time that the giant animals had begun to die out. Then came the Wokwine Range and the Robe 1 Range, and lastly Robe 2, formed merely 80,000 years ago. A further retreat of the sea and then a return to the present sea level happened only within Aboriginal tribal memory, say about 8,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. Each time as the sea retreated, water was trapped between these dune ranges, resulting in copies of the present-day Coorong Lake system. So, 500,000 years ago, stretching from the Narracourt Ranges to Baker's Range would have been a shallow sea, like the present Coorong, or like it is today, a flat, ancient seabed, fertile, but often very wet in winter. Every time the sea retreated, a new range of dunes was formed. Lake Bonny and Lake George are the nearest to Millicent of examples of such back dune lakes. Because of this geological formation and the porous limestone, no natural creeks and rivers were created. So at the time of European settlement, this whole southeast region was, in the wintertime, an immense series of landlocked swamps and lakes covering flat land of good farming potential. It was nearly impossible to travel from Adelaide in the winter. Sometimes 3/4 of the whole area was underwater, and to travel the 100 k's from Penola to Robe, more than half of the distance was underwater. Mr. John MacDonald, who opened the Kangaroo Inn at Reedy Creek in 1861, claimed that in 1849 he could have sailed a boat from the Murray River to Mount Muirhead near Millicent. And the mail coming from Adelaide via Meningie would take 6 or more days, with the mailman often having to put the mailbags on the horse's neck to keep them dry before plunging into the water. Before 1860, some farmers had constructed small private drains. These proved beneficial locally, but one must wonder what the neighbours who received this extra water thought of it. There were, in fact, plenty of complaints, particularly from Jack and his family. But seriously, in the summer of 1863, a party from Adelaide consisting of Hanson, Milne and the Surveyor-General Mr. George Goyder inspected the whole area on horseback and came up with some possible drainage plans. Hanson saw drains solely as a means to make roads possible. Goyder had a wider vision. Certainly, drains to make roads, but also make farming development possible. The sale of this drained land for farming would please the government and provide money to eventually pay for the drains. This word eventually took more than a century. This idea did create some interest in government circles, but not enough to get a promise of money. Meanwhile, following an idea credited to Mr. William Crouch, and almost against government intention, the first scheme of drainage began with Mr. McCalman and a team of 20 men putting a single cut through the bank called Narrow Neck at Rendlesham near Millicent. This was finished in 1864 at a cost of only $160, and as the local newspaper reported, with water leaping and roaring through it like a mountain torrent all winter. This turned Lake Frome from a small swamp to a 25 square kilometre lake, which then flowed north into Lake George. But it was another 3 years before Goyder could send the first batch of 100 unemployed men by sea to begin work. The men had to be rowed ashore in small boats at this beach, and then had to drag all the gear through the surf and sand and then struggle inland over the dunes. And it was another 20 years before the very successful drainage of Millicent Flats was in effect finished. During this time, agriculture increased and hundreds of workers camped on the site, which eventually became Millicent Township. By 1872, 100 kilometres of drains through the Millicent Flats were completed, and some of the first land was put up for sale, which would have pleased the State Treasurer. Nevertheless, work was shut down for the next 3 years. Even after that, work was still intermittent, depending on the wetness of winter and the rate at which the workers got tired of the whole thing and went back to the city. Yet the boom year for Millicent was 1879, when there were 500 drain or railway workers out of a total town population of 700 people and 154 houses. Try and imagine 500 workers crowding into the front bar of Tantrum's Hotel on a Saturday night. The next year, there was no government money, and only 30 drain workers remained. Eventually, 300 kilometres of drains were finished, and 50,000 hectares of drained land sold for $7 per hectare. Bringing in $350,000 for the government, this set sights on extending drains over larger areas. Problems with disgruntled or drunk workers remained, and construction methods were still pick, shovel, wheelbarrow. Then, trying to get round the labour problems, 2 huge excavation machines were built in Sydney for the job, but broke down so often that they were sent back. The cost of moving earth by machine had cost more than paying men using wheelbarrows, even with strikes or drunken workers.